What's going on, folks, and welcome to another quick news drop for Eternum. I have been closely following an interview that was recently done with Amazon Game Studios and a company known as Respawn First. When I first found out about it, the media site stated that this interview was done through the Xbox magazine, but after subscribing to it and reading through every single page I could, it seemed to be nowhere to be found. But after finding out that Respawn actually had an article on the website for it, I was able to find it and scan through all the details we could possibly get from it. Along with this interview, I also did find an article that featured Scott Lane, the game director. This one had a lot of details that we already knew about, but it did give a backstory on Scott himself and may just provide a hat tip on why they are planning to support New World for up to 10 years after its launch. This one comes from the GameStar website, and they are the ones who provided us with all the expanded alpha footage along with the details about the New World points of interest on the map. But enough about that, let's go ahead and get right into the details. So taking a look at the Respawn First article, we can see that they start off the interview by talking about the Amazon Web Services. This, as we all know, should hopefully serve to be one of New World's strong points, especially during its beta phase and launch. These days we constantly get plagued with server and optimization issues. Even in recent titles we've seen this type of thing stop games dead in their tracks. But Amazon is confident that the power of the cloud is going to keep New World stable and give it the ability to scale at great lengths with the support of the Lumberyard engine. These two aspects, along with their Twitch integration plan, are going to be a heavy influence on how we interact with the game. Right after this, they talk about how the game takes its inspiration combat-wise from other titles like Dark Souls. In other article interviews, we also get a bit more backstory on the staff members included in the interview, such as David Verfaeli and another staff member he's worked very closely with over the years, Michael Willett. The both of them have worked together on many different projects, but most notably for the two of them, they have worked on games like Killer Instinct. When it comes to Scott Lane directly, he's also had experience with other titles such as Baldur's Gate and Gauntlet. And as we saw a while back from the MMO Huts interview during the pre-alpha, the team also has members that are avid Darkfall fans, which gives them some experience in the MMO sandbox field. Along with this, the article itself tells us that they also have experience with games like PlanetSide, Star Wars Galaxies, Destiny, and World of Warcraft. So we may see hints of inspiration from those games sprinkled into the game's future. In that GameStar interview that I mentioned earlier, what does get very interesting about Scott Lane's backstory is the following two quotes. I was able to rough translate these from their language, and it also seems to get supported by the brief text above them. Essentially, the first quote translates to how Scott Lane is talking about how he made a lot of friends at Blizzard, and also asked them for something like World of Warcraft Classic for several years. And on top of that, the game itself is very fun for him. He loves going back and playing that old version, which he personally prefers. He doesn't know if he would call it more hardcore, it's actually just different in his eyes, which I do have to say does interest me quite a bit. I'm curious to know which part Scott Lane prefers from Classic WoW as opposed to retail, not counting the upcoming Shadowlands of course, because this was written before the alpha. But I'd like to know if it was the PvP aspect or on the player versus environment side that he preferred more. In retail, you have a system very similar to what we'll be getting in New World, which is classified as War Mode, but in Classic you are essentially free game. But on the other side of that, retail in terms of its leveling experience, gearing progression, and all-around difficulty are vastly different from what you would see in Classic. And I hope that at the very least, if that is the part that Scott Lane prefers instead, that I hope New World stays true to that as well. In my opinion, I do think that you should have a good amount of challenge in these games, especially when it comes to the end game. Whether it's the progression or the day-to-day activities, it's very important to develop it in a way where it can provide that challenging aspect while retaining that fun factor and convincing us to continue playing. And in New World, it does seem like the creatures and the AI aren't just pincushions that just stand there while we attack them. They seem to dodge our attacks as well as cast skills of their own when necessary. So that's something that is refreshing, and I do hope that it continues in future titles as well. As for the next quote, this one is prompted after the interviewers had given Scott Lane a brief look of skepticism due to expecting New World to be influenced by classic World of Warcraft in some way, or at least that's what it sounds like they had meant there. But for the rough translation, Scott Lane replies by saying that for New World, they're focusing more on the war and invasion mechanics. Instead of looking at classic WoW, he prefers to look at things like action RPG fighting experiences that they can bring in. They want to incorporate physics-based battles into the MMO genre, because that's something that's new and different from the classic approach that we're used to. Which of course we do have titles that can provide that action combat experience in the genre, but there are very few of them currently. And of those few, some of them can be heavily influenced by microtransactions or feel extremely lackluster in one area or many different others. So having more of this particular particular type is always a plus in my eyes. But now after they talk more about the classless system and story setting, they finally bring us to the million-dollar line of the game. David Verfaeli, the player experience lead, tells us that Amazon Game Studios has plans to support the game and its combat system over the span of 10 years. Now I'm sure that's already popped up 50 questions into your head as you read or heard this like it did for me, but I think the biggest thing to note at this very moment is that immediately changes a lot of perspectives that I'm sure a lot of players had with the game. Now, as we know, Amazon Game Studios is not only developing just New World for their games. In Seattle, they have a separate studio that focuses specifically on a game called Crucible that I have covered before. But in this specific team's location, they also have people working on their upcoming Lord of the Rings MMORPG iteration. Alongside them in Irvine, California, they also have a studio that's owned by Liu Technologies that also works on the game. But this quote ultimately means that instead of the Lord of the Rings MMO being in direct development conjunction or the flagship game for Amazon Game Studios, that New World might actually become their primary flagship, unlike what a lot of people might have expected. I guess when I read this, my very first few questions consisted of things like, how many expansions are we going to see? Does this mean that they're going to lean away from just being an MMO with sandbox elements and actively develop the story? And most importantly, what are they planning to specifically add for content over the course of this 10 plus years? Now, of course, I would personally imagine that this 10-year plan could ultimately depend on the success of the game itself. It's completely understandable that if the game isn't meeting ends meet, that the 10-year plan could ultimately be cut short to focus on other or more lucrative projects. Or that if the game really takes off, that 10-year plan may just turn into a 20-plus year one. But the fact that we've learned that they already have a roadmap planned and content planned for up to 12 months already, it sounds like they are very confident in what they'll be able to deliver, which is always a good sign for development teams because having these kinds of plans build the greatest foundations you could hope to make. And I do think a game like this could truly succeed if they do it right. One thing that I'm immediately going to jump on yet again in this conversation is that if they are wanting to make this game more focused on the territory war aspect and have mechanics like invasions, dynamic events, and the faction system, then they will 100% need to have more activities related not just to the player versus environment aspect, but also the PvP part too. I mentioned in a previous video that this game might greatly benefit from having open world points of interest that we can capture and fight over all day within our respective factions for rewards. And perhaps they could even tie this into the influence system so players will have even more reason to use it. But now we'll just have to see what exactly they have planned for us in these upcoming months. Now, along with this, I did also want to go over that recently on Twitter, they mentioned that we are still in fact getting a 4th dev diary that they are planning to have out by the end of the month. Along with that, they'll also be giving us more developer blogs and screenshots leading up to the closed beta in July. Hopefully everything stays on track so we can have both a smooth and enjoyable launch, and at the same time that everyone stays safe and healthy to ensure their well-being during these tough times. They will also be having a giveaway for alpha keys on their Twitter, so be sure to head over and follow them if you haven't already. And with that, folks, that is actually all the news we have to talk about today. In smaller news, they seem to be hiring still for different positions for the game's development, so that still is a good sign. This one appears to be a listing for a software development engineer that's going to be working on designing new engine tools and technology for powering games. They also appear to be tasked with collaborating with engineers and content creators to create these tools, as well as architect level systems which scale for large sets of data. This sounds like it might be heavily influenced by their Twitch integration plans, but this certainly seems to be a position to keep an eye on. But as always, folks, let me know what you think about the overall vision for this game and if you think they might be successful in their 10-year plan for it. What do you think you'd like to see over the course of that, whether it's expansion, content, or story related? I'll keep you guys posted as more news becomes available. I hope you have a wonderful night or day, and thanks very much again for watching, and farewell.